US is not the leading science producer in the world anymore. In 2022, US has spent almost $1 trillion on research and development, publishing more than 457,000 papers, while China has been catching up since 2000s. It surpassed US in 2016, publishing almost 900,000 articles in 2022. Now, China is the leading producer of science and technology in the world. At the same time, cost of science has been increasing in the US compared to China. In 2022, cost of an article in the US was about $2 million, more than double the $903,000 it cost in China. As the US is still a stance, its falling behind is not because of a societal collapse, but through a far more complex machinery. Meanwhile, DOGE did this.
All right, let's take you back to the White House now. In the first 100 days of President Trump's second term, DOGE has been making cuts at the NIH, or National Institutes of Health. The agency is the world's largest supporter of biomedical research, and since January, it has fired over 1,300 employees and canceled more than $2 billion in federal research grants.
This will have unforgiving and irreversible consequences for the US. In this episode, we turn to the finances of science in the era of big science. Not just asking how much science costs, but to ask what those costs are buying us, what happens when we stop buying it, and what will be the future of science in the US. So, what are the statistics of science's finances? Previously, we defined eminent scientists as the square root of the total number of scientists who publish 50% of all papers, Price's square root law. Therefore, to double the number of eminent scientists, we need to quadruple the number of all scientists. But how much does it cost to double the number of eminent scientists? In 1963, the expenditure on science was doubling every 5.5 years, meaning the cost of science quadrupled every 10 years. At the same time, number of scientists doubled every 10 years. So the cost per scientist doubled every 10 years, and therefore it is a function of total number of scientists. This means to double the number of Oppenheimers and Einsteins of society, we need to increase the spending 16-fold. At this scale, small policy errors don't merely slow the progress. They determine whether the next generation of elite scientists exists at all. But can we afford this increase? In any country, the money comes from the gross domestic product, GDP. In a decade, GDP must increase to cover increase in R&D spending, devaluation of money due to inflation, and complexity cost. In 1953 and 1963, the US spent about $38 and $109 billion respectively, calculated in constant 2017 dollars. These were 1.33 and 2.75% of GDP in their respective years. The spending data includes all sources, federal and non-federal. The $71 billion increase in R&D spending was about 6.5% of GDP growth in that decade. From 1953 to 2022, according to NSF, the expenditure of science as a percentage of GDP, corrected to 2017 dollars, has been slowly increasing from 1.33% to almost 3.5%, indicating US's tremendous capacity for increasing its science spending. But how much science can we buy with this money? From 1996 to 2022, US's science and engineering papers increased from about 305,000 to about 457,000 papers, 50% increase over a 50-year period. The average cost per paper has been creeping up from $950,000 in 1960 to $1.6 million in 2022. So we increased the total spending by 160%, but we only got 50% increase in total productivity. Price 2 showed that despite a 4.5-fold increase in spending from 1950 to 1960, we only doubled the number of papers. This is a cybernetic feedback loop that tends to slow down the growth from exponential to logistic and then into saturated state. As we saw in episode 1, it took US about 300 years to reach its current state of scientific capability, and by the laws of nature we saw, its growth is slowing down. But how did China catch up so fast within decades when it took the US centuries to grow? From 1910 to 1960, the US and Britain kept their share of scientific productivity, while France lost some, and the USSR, Japan, and others increased theirs exponentially. Japan's growth was even faster than the US's normal exponential growth, while Germany lost a huge share, likely to US. Although Japan grew exponentially in 1900, NSF data shows that its productivity has been capped around 103,000 papers since 2003, despite doubling their annual spending from $100 to $200 billion. Japan's share fell from 8% in 2003 to 3% in 2022, while China grew from 7% to 26%. At the same time, US's share dropped from 26% to 13%. So, Japan also grew explosively at the beginning of 1900s, and understanding Japan's growth process will help us understand China's process. Let's consider physics in Japan. The first wave of growth, the 0th generation of physicists in Japan, were the foreign teachers and foreign educated Japanese who taught the first generation of physicists in the schools and universities. Inevitably, the first wave rapidly died as the teachers left or passed away. But when the 0th generation was at its peak, it was transferring knowledge to the first generation of physicists, initiating the second wave of growth. Then the first generation trained the second generation of physicists at its peak, doubling in a decade, growing nearly 6% a year. This double shockwave growth was equivalent to an exponential growth that started in 1881 with 12 initial physicists. It took 20 years for the homegrown physicists to take root, beginning the steady state growth, translating the knowledge and teaching it at all educational levels. Japan's growth was about 6% per year from 1910 to 1960, while US had a 4.6% annual growth. This allowed Japan to rise from a non-existent state to a serious contender. Japan's explosive growth was because it began in a different era. China has the same pattern. Today, it is much easier to have an explosive growth in an underdeveloped country than it was 200 years ago. Countries' ranks in scientific hierarchy are stable so long as people work hard and money is spent to maintain it. This race will be over when all countries reach the top of their logistic curve. Therefore, limiting scientific spending to a percentage of GDP like Iran did and only increasing it with GDP growth in prices words is tantamount to a suicidal withdrawal from the scientific race. Now that we have examined all the stages of scientific growth, we can talk about the process an underdeveloped country takes to grow today. At the beginning, the number of scientists is too low to make any crystallization possible. But as their numbers grows, the crystallization into groups and scientific cities begins, while the relative return of the first-class scientists diminishes. To double the number of eminent scientists, we must quadruple the total. The standard may not be lowered, but because the top tier grows so much slower than the average tier, the average quality is decreased. The logistic decline and saturation happens because we are using all the elites for crystallization and productivity while pouring more manpower and money into the system without the same growth of the past decades. The reduction of scientific returns in quality and the stagnation of quantity per dollar spent is certainly a good reason for the recent budget cuts in science by the US federal government. But we must remember, crystallization happens around the eminent. All eminent scientists are men and all men are mortal. At the top of the logistic curve where the US is right now, the number of elite scientists will remain constant until they pass away. Losing our elite scientists results in collapse of the scientific hierarchy, leading to seizure of scientific progress. On the other hand, stopping the inducements will result in the redirection of forces that demand steady growth and maintaining the productivity towards other parts of the society with outcomes that we may not desire. So, what are these undesirable effects? Bad investment policies upset the natural hierarchical balance of fields and countries. Initially, many different fields and topics with very few top leaders are formed. The competition for these top minds leads to incentives offered to scientists to work in more glamorous fields like AI today or physics, math and astronomy back in 1960s. This deprives other fields like medicine, engineering and education of top minds. Within a discipline, a small invisible college with 100 eminent scientists can turn into a giant powerhouse, attracting more manpower and resources. Its budget and expenditure grows as it hires more researchers to finish ever-increasing projects. Scientists also flow from countries where manpower is easily produced to places like US where it is very expensive to train new manpower. This is a crystallization process where the talent goes to a singular major hub. The consequence is that the departing country is left without any elites to lead its scientific communities. Therefore, US at its saturated growth stage not only has to spend more money to maintain its number of elite scientists and productivity because of the cybernetic feedback, but also it has to compete with other countries who can attract their elite scientists. But money is not the only reward the modern scientist seeks. In the era of big science, there are other incentives for the individual to pursue a career in science. So, what are these incentives? The individual who becomes a scientist does so to receive some sort of an emotional gratification, like a dopaminergic reward or a serotonergic reward because of the individual's social status. The reward system is very important and will affect what kind of a person will be attracted to be a scientist. Since the beginning of 20th century in the US and USSR, the prestige of scientists, their social status, and the respect for them greatly increased. The competition demanded their existence. Thus, salaries, research funds, and facilities increased. Each increase in prestige raised the productivity and competition. For scientists, the stakes of the next round were higher. Once the status raised and pay increased, there was no return to the good old days of subsistence, because these scientists were different. They were not like Newton, solving gravitation and leaving the Principia unpublished until Halley found and funded its publication. The reward system won't be an issue if those entering science are actually competent, but data shows that general and specific intelligence has little predictive capacity for scientific creativity. The best we can do, as discussed in episode 2, is to set a minimum threshold of intelligence and other abilities. Once above these thresholds, the likelihood of eminence seems random. Beyond IQ, one key quality a scientist must have is mavricity, the ability to make unusual associations and do the unexpected. This aligns with the personality trait openness. However, mavricity must be balanced with conservatism. Scientists must control their enthusiasm for their own and others' radical ideas. This translates to low neuroticism, low extraversion, and a degree of disagreeableness to resist easy agreements with others, as I showed before. These qualities, among others, allow scientists to remain objective. But in the era of big science, mavricity is often suppressed. Group pressure, either from invisible colleges or collaborative groups, pushes scientists towards collectivism and mass-mindedness. Clear examples are string theory and quantum gravity in physics. These are dead-end fields with no tangible results that their followers refuse to stop believing in them. We must let the individuals follow their own trails. Price's solution is to give scientists freedom, allowing them to do what they do best, with no constraints on research goals, while granting them status and prestige. But given the list of questionable grants awarded by the federal government, one might be cautious in doing so. Now, how will the reward system change the role of scientists in society? The reward system includes social status recognition and financial rewards. Social status comes from validation by peers. Scientists get this through seminars and conferences. It acknowledges his mavricity and his triumphs against conservatism of science and secrecy of nature. From Jordan Peterson's viewpoint, it is the classic hero myth. The scientist is the hero, while his skepticism towards new ideas is one dragon, and the secrecy of Mother Nature, who tends to hide her inner working mechanisms, is another one. The scientists who are widely acknowledged by invisible colleges and lesser groups can have a better life. They can get more money, pick better students, and pursue the most difficult projects, thereby gaining fame, fortune, and influence. This power is not a selfish desire either, as society pays for it and demands the scientist's success for its security and welfare. Price argues that the scientist's power is equal to the kings and generals who could change regimes and influence policy. In some countries, it is those with money who are the contenders of a state's legislature or body. In others, lawyers have more power. In a democracy, all these groups have some power, scientists being one of them. But scientists have been passive in politics, only approached when a problem arose, while with great power comes great responsibility. Therefore, scientists must become more politically active, as it is very important how we manage our limited resources. In 1963, only 3% of US parliamentarians and active politicians were scientists, while in USSR 25% of the Supreme Council were scientists. In the old days, scientists were good with things and bad with people. They were averting political action and got their social validation from their peers. Nowadays, scientists are well known, like Oppenheimer and Einstein, and that puts them in a more affluent position. Now that we have passed the logistic part of the curve, aiming to be the first and to publish first is not the way to go. There is more responsibility in the scientific community towards society, and we can agree with that. But with this higher role scientists must take, what should be the moral and ethical limits they should adhere to? Perhaps a sort of Hippocratic oath is needed, but this is not easy to implement. Physicians take it due to personal responsibility towards their patients, but scientists' customers are the state and the society. Developing such boundaries is much harder because scientists do not have direct feedback that physicians have. The decisions a scientist makes, such as the shutdown during pandemic or forcing people to wear masks or take vaccines, has consequences that the scientists and politicians won't pay them, the people do. Or what should be scientists' responsibility towards inventions like nuclear weapons? Scientists were unanimous about this issue. We can find a good analysis in Robert Gilpin's American Scientists and Nuclear Weapon Policy. We can agree with Price that scientists have much more power than they think. Therefore, they need to be more active in political and decision-making processes. We can hope that scientists will be better political leaders, a hope we may have reservations for as its path is filled with obstacles. But we can agree that science will make or break the society. Finally, what can we say about DOGE savings in R&D spending? I personally rooted for Elon Musk to succeed in eliminating waste and fraud in government, but cutting science's budget must be done surgically and not en masse as it was done so. The US federal and non-federal spending on the science is only 3% of the GDP, with $345 billion federal R&D spending making only 40% of the total spending in 2022. This was only 8.5% of the fiscal budget that year, less than a dime on a dollar, with $1.4 trillion in deficit. So even if we cut all the federal R&D budget, we would not solve the deficit problem. What was cut was not all waste and fraud, but necessary budget to allow the scientific machinery combat the forces that want to halt its progress. What can we do instead? We need to increase the spending and make it more targeted to keep the lead in the scientific race. If budget cuts are required in the scientific apparatus of society reasonably to reduce the government's deficit, we can start from the draconian rules and role of universities and make their bureaucratic system more efficient, thereby decreasing the expenses. We must increase the efficiency. In the US, if I get a $1 million grant, the university will take about 50% of it. Increasing the efficiency will reduce the overhead percentage and thereby increasing the research funds. Then whatever I produce, papers or technology or patent, is owned by the university, not me. And if a patent is licensed, then the university gets the royalty, not the scientists. The problem of monetizing products like patents is that the universities do not have the motivation and incentives as the inventor may have to commercialize the work. Perhaps increasing the scientist's share of royalty will incentivize them to commercialize it, thereby increasing the available funds for research. Alternatively, the university can return more of the income from royalties to the scientist as research budget. But what do we get in return for the overhead money taken by the university? A bureaucratic system that signs my paycheck and pays me with my own grant money. It slows down my research by wasting my time following unnecessary rules and regulations, reducing productivity. And it is extremely inefficient in monetizing my output and returning it into the research cycle. The result of 2025's NIH budget cut was that many of the professors ran out of money. But did we cut bureaucrats and regulations and make the system more efficient? No, we cut the next generation, the PhD students who work as research and teacher assistants and are paid by the same grants that were cut. My own project as a postdoctoral researcher was cut, and now I'm an overqualified dasher and an aspiring YouTuber. What happens if the next pandemic hits and we don't have the qualified scientists who can make the vaccines? What happens if Iran decides to dig a deeper tunnel to hide its nuclear enrichment plant and we don't have the smart enough engineers to hold their beers so they can make the new GBU-57? One thing is clear, we can cap out spending and be like Japan. We can reduce our spending and watch science die, or we can purposefully increase our spending to be the first who makes the next breakthrough, starting the next exponential growth.